My name is Lois Sturba, and I am a board member of the Downers Grove Historical Society. I've lived in Downers Grove for about 30 years and very interested in history. So the Historical Society was something that I was very interested in. Our society started in 1968, and our mission is to preserve the history of the past for future generations. So that's what we're doing here. One of my jobs on the Historical Society was treasurer for many years, but now I have gone to the position of historian. And as historian, what I'm doing is researching information about Downers Grove, and particularly the information about this Main Street Cemetery. This cemetery is 165 years old. I look at this cemetery as a large history book or a living history museum, because you can walk through this cemetery and find all kinds of interesting things about Downers Grove history. Back in the 1960s, they first started doing that, researching the history of this cemetery to gather all the information they could, because many of the markers have been lost and are gone, and we want to preserve all the history that we can. I've always been interested in historical societies, no matter where I lived. When we moved to Downers Grove in the 1990s, I was very happy to see a historical society and also a historical museum. One day when I walked by the museum, I walked in and looked around and was soon conducting tours of the Blodgett house on Maple Avenue. And then I also began running summer day camps out of the museum and conducting tours. I always like to introduce the history to the students in school, and as a former teacher, I'd like to include the history of Downers Grove in the curriculum of the Downers Grove Grade School District. And then as a retired teacher, I take the students on field trips, and we go visiting different historic places in Downers Grove. The location of the cemetery often was a mystery to me, but then I realized that when the people came to Downers Grove to settle here in the 1840s and 30s, they lived right around this area. This Maple Avenue that we have here was the old Indian boundary line, which was a traveling trail through the village, and many people lived on that trail to get to the east and down to Chicago. So when they had someone who passed away in the family, many of them just buried their relatives on family land, and some of the family land was across Maple Avenue to the south of where we are now. In 1856, some concerned citizens thought that it would be nice if we had a specific place for burial here. Now, Downers Grove, like to tell you, did have a cemetery on the west side over by Belmont on the Stanley family ground, but that was quite a ways from here. And these people who lived here wanted to bury their family members closer to where they lived. So Mr. Sam Curtis, who lived on Maple Avenue, decided that he would sell 1/2 acre of his cow pasture to become the official cemetery here in this location in Downers Grove. And if you look at the land of the cemetery, it's nice and flat. We don't have a lot of flat land in Downers Grove, so you can picture this as being an old cow pasture. So in 1856, there were several graves by Maple Avenue, and they were brought over here. And then after 1856, this was officially declared the cemetery, and it has remained a cemetery now for 165 years. The people buried here range from dates prior to 1856, those who were brought here to be buried, and up until 1938, when the cemetery was then officially closed. I think the Main Street Cemetery gives us in Downers Grove a pleasant park-like green space area that is in the middle of a very busy business district. The half-acre piece of green space is walked through by many people as they're going east and west to Main Street and to the apartments on the other side of Fishel Park. And it is just an enjoyable place for people to visit. Yes, the Main Street Cemetery is very rare. The records show that only 2 cities in the United States still maintain a Main Street cemetery because this land is very valuable. There was a push in the 1920s to remove the Main Street Cemetery and to use this land for business purposes, but people decided that they wanted to maintain this cemetery. In fact, some of the graves that were, people who were interred in graves here were removed because they were afraid that was going to happen. But the Main Street Cemetery has remained for the 165 years, and we're very happy to have it here because it presents so much of the history of past Downers Grove that we could never recreate anywhere else. It has been a challenge keeping up with the Main Street Cemetery. Anything that's 165 years old, of course, is going to suffer from deterioration. So the Historical Society and the village entered into an agreement in 1999 to restore the cemetery. We've had groups coming through the cemetery as far back as the 1960s to locate graves and to document where the monuments were and write down maps of the cemetery. But by 1999, it was evident that we needed a lot of restoration that would be costly. To replace tombstones, to add tombstones, to just landscape the area and fence the area and put a wall up. Every year we receive money from the village of Downers Grove to do that. And restoring the cemetery then became the project of the Downers Grove Historical Society. The daily maintenance of the cemetery is done by the forestry department of the village of Downers Grove. They cut the grass and prune the bushes and take care of the trees that are here. In researching the history of the cemetery, I found that history dates back many years. 2 graves we have in the cemetery are for ladies who were daughters of Revolutionary War soldiers. Even though they came to live here back in the 1830s, their parents fought in the Revolutionary War. So we have 2 graves there. We have a grave of Sam Curtis, who fought in the War of 1812. And fighting in the War of 1812, he was entitled to scrip, which was money for his service. And that scrip he used to buy land here in Downers Grove. So Sam Curtis bought his land here and moved here from Vermont after fighting in the War of 1812. In this small cemetery, which is only a half of an acre, we can identify 10 Civil War soldiers who served in the war. Some of them died in the war, some of them died of battle, some of them died of illness, some of them came back here to live out their lives. But in this very small cemetery, we can identify those. We can also identify in this cemetery people like Israel Blodgett, who was a blacksmith. He brought his trade to Downers Grove. It was needed for the pioneers when they were building homes and needing things of iron and to be made. And he also was active in the Underground Railroad. And we have identified several people who worked with him on the Underground Railroad who are buried here in this cemetery. I think the next generation will be in pretty good shape because the Downers Grove Historical Society on the 150th anniversary of the cemetery produced a book called Voices That Are Gone, and it is a written history of the cemetery, of the people buried here. Now, we weren't satisfied with that, so the Downers Grove Historical Society also launched an app, MainStreetCemetery.com, where you can go online and you can actually see all the people buried in the cemetery and read stories about them. Some of them are audio.
Gracie Wells was the daughter of Arvilla Bond and John Manning Wells. Gracie passed away in 1883 at the tender young age of 5. In her memory, her father worked with local officials.
Now, we were very concerned about the land here and if we are finding all of the remains. So We engaged the services of the Raymaker engineering firm of Sauk Village, Wisconsin, and they came in and did a ground-penetrating radar survey of the cemetery, and we found for us remains of all people here. Some of them we have marked, some of them we have not marked, but with their findings, we can now go back, check old records and old tombstones that might have been removed and old maps, and we can put together more of the history of the cemetery. So this cemetery will not ever be forgotten or lost because of all of the modern things that we've done to try and keep people's attention. Many of the early pioneers who came to settle here were abolitionists. They had come from the East and they knew that the way of slavery is something that they did not want. So one of their reasons to move west, in addition to gaining more land for their families, was to be in a place where men would be free. In Illinois, there was no slavery. This was a free state. However, if a slave was caught in Illinois, a slave had to be returned. Anyone helping a slave to escape could be fined or imprisoned. So being an abolitionist in Illinois in the years before the Civil War was really a pretty risky thing to do. We've had several people who are buried here. David Page and Israel Blodgett, namely, were abolitionists, and they would hide the slaves in their homes as they came up through the South. The slaves were intent on getting to Lake Michigan in Chicago, and from Lake Michigan they'd get on a boat and get to Canada, where Canada would keep them safe, as Queen Victoria had outlawed slavery years before, and they were safe there. So being an abolitionist in Downers Grove, this is why we have a monument here to them, is because they did something that was really extraordinary and risky for them and for their families. Another interesting person buried here is Henry Carpenter. He came here in 1845 with his family. He again came out here to be a farmer and decided after he got here that farming really wasn't what he wanted to do. So he had a home on Maple Avenue, which is still there, and he opened that as a general store. It also was the post office for a time for the village. Henry Carpenter provided the first general store in 1845, so people coming through on the Indian boundary line would have a place to stop. He ordered supplies from Chicago, and they were brought in by the son of Martin Root, who was buried in this cemetery. He brought the supplies in, and the general store then provided an important service to the community. One unique grave here is that of Israel Blackburn. Israel Blackburn came to live in Downers Grove after the Civil War, but what makes him so unique is that he was a former slave. He joined the Union Army as a middle-aged soldier in the 1860s, served in the Army, the 124th Colored Infantry in Kentucky, and came up here after the war. We are very honored to have him buried here in our cemetery. He became a very valuable citizen to Downers Grove after coming to the village. He had a small farm here. He even signed our incorporation papers in 1873. So he presented a lot of love for the village. He was very interested in joining the Grand Army of the Republic, and he was interested in coming to the cemetery on Decoration Day, which we call Memorial Day now. He could be seen walking up and down the cemetery here, placing flowers on graves, and that was something that was done in many cemeteries after the Civil War. So he was looked upon as a valued citizen, giving his experiences as a slave, adding that history to our village. But one very unique monument we have in the Main Street Cemetery is the Broken Tree Monument that marks the Wells family graves. The Broken Tree Monument is a monument that was created by the Woodman Society of America. The Woodmen's Society of America was a fraternal organization starting after the Civil War to help soldiers financially, and one of their benevolent things was to mark graves of all family members who belonged to this Woodmen's Society. The monuments are specifically designed by local monument companies according to the Woodman's specification. The broken tree signifies a person's life cut off early and not fulfilling it. There's also the monument next to the broken tree, which is a Woodman's monument for a child, and that is the child of John Wells, Amy Wells. Amy and Gracie Wells, there are two girls buried there. And this is a child's Woodman's monument. You'll notice that it has a tree motif to that also. So these monuments are put there, and many people who belong to the Woodmans had these. A local monument maker, Mr. Kaler, who was from Naperville, was the one who designed the Woodman's monument. And if you look down at the bottom of the stone, you will see Mr. Kaler's name engraved in that stone. Captain Walter Blanchard of the 13th Illinois Infantry, who served in the Civil War, is honored here in the cemetery. He was a very interesting person, a judge in the DuPage County at the age of 54. When Lincoln asked for volunteers to fight the Civil War, he stood up and said that he would go. He rallied about 100 men from the area to join him, and in the 13th Illinois Infantry, then they went and fought many battles in the war. He fought till the very end. He was one of those who died in battle, and he told the parents of all the boys that he took down there to fight that he would stay with them till the very end, and he did that. When he was wounded, he was injured in the leg, and having lost a lot of blood, the soldiers tried to get him to a medical facility to try and help him, but it was too late, and he passed away. His body was respectfully brought back here to Downers Grove and placed here in the cemetery. He's the only Blanchard buried here. His two sons also fought in the war, but they are buried in different cemeteries. Emma Foster Miller is buried here. She was the very last person to be buried in the Main Street Cemetery in 1938. Her history in Downers Grove goes back a long way. Her father, Alexander Foster, fought in the Civil War. Part of Emma's love was of the Downers Grove Library. She was one of the ladies who wrote to Andrew Carnegie and requested that Carnegie think about building a Carnegie Library here in Downers Grove. Many villages were lucky to have Mr. Carnegie honor them by sending money to build a library. So she was one of the original library ladies to have the library built here in the 1920s. She was also very interested in this cemetery because her father and her mother were buried in the cemetery, and she cared much about keeping the cemetery up, so monies were raised when she was alive to restore the cemetery and build fencing and to take care of the cemetery. So Emma was probably the last real caretaker of the cemetery because she was the last person buried here, and she was very interested in keeping this cemetery intact and restored. I would hope that the next generation also feels the love of history and wants to learn about the people of Downers Grove, especially the pioneers who made this village starting in 1832, to learn about these things. And you don't have to learn just from a book. You can learn by going places like this cemetery and experience and looking at all of the historical things that you find in the village. So a cemetery is one place you're going to find history, and you're going to find it in many places in Downers Grove, but I really do hope the young generation will want to include that love of history in their life. A lot of people wonder about people who like cemeteries, like me. Well, my love of cemeteries starts from when I was a small child. My grandmother would take us at least twice a week to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried in order to put flowers on the grave. It was a very important thing. As a child then, I learned that the cemetery was a friendly place and a place to learn about relatives that I never knew or would never have a chance to have known, and history of the people. When I think of a cemetery, I don't think about how these people died when they died. I think about who they were and when they lived and what they have done for the world. Their death is not as important as the lives that they led. This is a cemetery. Lives are commemorated, deaths are recorded, families are reunited, memories are made tangible, and love is undistinguished. This is a cemetery. Communities afford respect, families bestow reverence, historians seek information, and our heritage is thereby enriched. Testimonies of devotion, pride, and warmth are carved in stone to pay tribute to accomplishments and to the life, not the death, of a loved one. The cemetery is homeland for memorials that are a sustaining source of comfort to the living. A cemetery is a history of a people, a perpetual record of yesterday, and a sanctuary of peace and quiet today. A cemetery exists because every life is worth loving and remembering always.